features that can make a lot of sense on a support. His Q, Decimating Smash, is a charged attack that hits an area in front of Sion, and it increases in damage and range for up to 2 seconds for a maximum of 300% damage. If Sion charges for less than a second, any enemy's hit will be briefly slowed, and of course if he charges for more than a second, he knocks up all enemies hit based on how long it was charged total. This jumps straight out as a pretty awesome support ability actually. Crowd control on a basic ability that can hit multiple enemies is always going to be powerful when used properly. One of the things that really stands out is Sion's ability to channel this from a brush to try to hit up an enemy and deal a ton of damage in the process. Catching one or both enemy laners in the knockup with all that damage in the early levels is just an insane amount of damage in crowd control, and could suggest Sion would potentially be a powerful lane bully, especially in matchups where the enemies can't deal with him from a range. Sion's W, Soul Furnace, is probably the worst part of his kit from a supporting perspective, and the passive part gives 2 bonus health to Sion permanently for every enemy he kills, along with 10 bonus health for large enemy, and champion kills and assists, but because Sion isn't going to be farming as a support, he's definitely missing out on a lot of potential bonus health in the early and mid game that he would have had if he was playing top lane. Activating Soul Furnace gives Sion a shield for up to 6 seconds that scales with his maximum health, and this could definitely be useful in lane for Sion because it would let him tank damage for his AD carry, survive through poke, and also be used to tank creep waves before they hit the tower if his AD carry wasn't quite back in lane yet. But with less stacks from farming, the shield isn't going to be as strong as possible. However, it is still somewhat useful for a Sion support. He can also activate the shield to detonate it after 3 seconds, of course dealing magic damage to nearby enemy units. That's again less useful for support Sion than it is for maybe a top lane or a jungle Sion, but if you needed to help wave clear or perhaps push out a wave, or maybe you just want to get a little bit more damage down in a fight, it can definitely help out and shouldn't be underestimated. His E is called Roar of the Slayer, and is another part of his kit that actually makes me quite excited for the Sion support playstyle. Activating the ability causes Sion to shout, dealing magic damage and slowing the target hit, along with reducing their armor by 20%. If he hits a minion or a non-epic monster, they're knocked back and deal 30% increased damage to all enemies they pass through, slowing them again by the same amount. And this is actually another contender for the ability that Sion support might want to max. In close range lanes where Sion can just slam the enemy laners with a Q from the brush, it's probably the better ability to max in that situation, but you could still definitely max E in lanes where you're struggling to reach the enemy. Hitting minions gives the ability crazy range and lets Sion poke or slow from relative safety as well. I love the fact that it also reduces armor to the unit hit directly, and this can be really valuable in the mid and late game when your AD carry wants to be able to punch more damage through tankier enemies. His E also combos well with his Q. You can slow a target with the E to make it easier to land a fully charged Q for that full knockup duration. And that's pretty crazy, especially on a support who can just build full tank. This combo along with Sion's shield can turn him into a potentially strong lane bully in some matchups that wants to dominate the lane and then snowball it into a win. Unstoppable Onslaught describes Sion pretty well, but it's also the name of his ultimate. This notorious charge ability lets Sion run into the target direction for 8 seconds, unable to attack or be crowd controlled until he collides with an object or until the ultimate is recasted. He can steer this ability slightly to try and run into enemies, but it's definitely kind of difficult to use as an initiation tool because it can be a little bit unreliable, especially against mobile champions. It does deal a ton of damage though, stuns and pulls in enemies that he collides with, and as well slows anyone that he damages afterwards. The damage and stun duration both build up over the first few seconds of the charge, so Sion is rewarded for managing to line up a long range ultimate onto the enemy team. It's really effective to use as the first engage in a fight when you can land it properly, but it does take a little bit of getting used to because it's kind of difficult to steer. However, the value of an ability like this in the kit of a support is just insane. Being able to quickly get across the map to help your team and make some roaming ganks is just awesome, and it kind of helps solidify the playstyle as a damage-based support with a ton of area effect crowd control, and it also gives them some really solid ganking power. It's typically a little bit difficult to land the ultimate, especially in the laning phase, but if you do manage to get off the stun from it on an enemy laner, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're at least getting a summoner spell or even a kill. It's just so much damage, and the crowd control is just awesome. It's got a lot of potential as a roaming ability as well, and you can get from bot lane to mid lane without that much issue, so a well-timed ultimate might let you use that awesome strength to snowball the rest of the map as well. Roaming's a super big part of the support metagame at the moment, so having an ability that does it really well is quite important. Sion's passive is Glory in Death, which could definitely see some potential as a support to make some plays in certain situations. Once he dies, he comes back to life, losing health over time until he dies again, and during that he can move and attack, dealing damage and healing with 100% lifesteal. It also turns all of his other abilities into Death Surge for the duration on a shared cooldown that gives Sion 50% bonus movement speed for 1.5 seconds, letting him chase down whoever might have killed him. And this would pretty much serve as a way to swing a fight that was potentially being lost in the bot lane, and it does kind of reward Sion for tanking damage and dying first in a laning phase fight, giving him that second chance to get damage down and put his respective AD carry ahead, and it can really be game changing in some laning phase fights honestly, so much more than it would in the top lane. You know, when you're in the top lane and your opponent kills you, the best you can do is just kill them and trade 1-for-1, but in a bot lane fight, if you die first, you can potentially still get a 2-for-1 and come out ahead, so the potential for this passive to impact the laning phase is so much more than it is in the top lane or really just anywhere else. It also pretty much prevents anyone from daring to tower dive Sion in the early game, because although you might kill him, he definitely still gets that chance for revenge, which means that even a low health Sion can effectively defend his AD carry or his turret, which is a pretty interesting way to make use of the passive. And that wraps up the kit overview, and as we can see, he definitely has some potential with the early game to impact the laning phase that could make him one of the more snowballier supports in the game, since he does have some level of initiation power. It seems like the best way to abuse this off-meta pick is to perhaps keep the side brushes unwarded and then use them to zone out the enemy hard. If they come near the bush, your insane damage and crowd control is going to punish them, and even if they stay away, then it makes it easy for your AD carry to freeze the lane and get some nice CS. One really cool part about his Q is that at the max range, it's about the same range as you need to actually walk up toward the bush. So if you're doing a good job of keeping the brush clear using pinks or a sweeper, you can channel your Q as the enemy support comes in toward it and then just go to town on them. There's always a valuable surprise factor with picks like Sion's support that shouldn't be ignored. When he's locked in, the enemy team's going to expect Sion in the top lane, or perhaps Sion in the jungle, and this could lead to bad top lane matchups for the enemy, and a favorable top lane matchup for your opponent, and even favorable bot lane matchups for Sion. When Sion's locked in, the enemy's pretty much always going to expect that it's Sion in the top lane until the very end of champion select, and this can lead to bad top lane matchups for your opponent, good top lane matchups for your top laner, and oftentimes even a favorable bot lane matchup for Sion. Another cool thing about Sion is that aside from his sulfur and his shield, his mana costs are actually quite low. He can use his Q and his E quite often in lane without worrying about going out of mana, unlike some champions that are a little bit more mana heavy like Blitzcrank or Thresh, who can run dry pretty fast and end up being useless in the attrition game. That being said, he's a little bit clunky as a champion, and players that know how to bait and avoid his abilities can potentially cause problems. That matters a bit less than top lane Sion though, because when supporting you're still really valuable as a damage soak and warder, and that off-meta bonus just adds in so much more, and even getting the armor reduction on a key target for your AD carry to attack as well is an awesome bonus. Champions that can dominate the early game are often a little bit less useful as the game goes on, and to be honest, that kind of seems true with Sion's support in some situations. His big early stats matter less as the game timer ticks up, and one of the big weaknesses of the pick is that he's a little bit difficult to use in a teamfight, since he's very vulnerable to being kited unless you can land a really solid ultimate. As a support, you want to be locking down the enemy team or peeling for your backline, but Sion's Q is pretty difficult to use in a fast-paced teamfight, but if you can land a key ultimate, it can really be game-changing and you can win teamfights all by yourself and make some awesome plays. So it really does take some getting used to, but being an initiator on Sion can lead to a lot of teamfight power and potentially allow you to carry those teamfights quite well. Apart from initiating with your ultimate, you really want to get into the enemy team's face and make them burn damage on your shield and your tanky build, while you try and use your crowd control on the most effective targets as possible, and potentially use that armor penetration effect on the enemy tanks or the targets that your AD carry is focusing. If you do use his early power to win lane as well, using him for surprise kills from unwarded bushes seems like a great way to get use out of his kit too. You can definitely use his crowd control to create some picks as well, especially using him for surprise kills from unwarded bushes, and his ultimate to catch out some targets. Once an enemy is dead, forcing objectives or a 4v5 teamfight means that you can get away with being a bit worse than other supports during the teamfight. And if you can create a pick, you definitely want to just force an objective immediately or perhaps a 4v5 teamfight. And his pick potential in his kit gives him a lot of opportunities in the mid and late game, even though his certain playstyle might not scale that effectively. From what we've seen, it definitely seems like Sion is a pick that really wants to crush the early game and try and snowball, and it definitely favors players who are familiar with Sion. It takes a little bit of time to get used to landing his ultimate and using the rest of his abilities. It doesn't seem like you can just pick him up and dominate games instantly, but it doesn't take that long to learn him because he still is quite a tanky champion and his mechanics aren't too complex apart from landing his ultimate on certain targets. And if you put in a bit of time to get used to his kit, then it might really be worth giving Sion support a good shot because it actually does seem to have a lot